Yeah, hello. I want to talk about privacy and I want to talk about the responsibility to preserve privacy and what we can do about it and what you as a developer can do about that. The thing I first want to explain where I'm coming from or what background I have. I studied computer science and after that I decided to work at netpolitik.org, which is a German news platform for everything related to net politics. That means surveillance and privacy and net neutrality and all those other topics around. We are quite known in Germany, we are the biggest political platform or blog as you call it. But we are just consisting of 5 people and we are there since 10 years and really trying to catch up with all the political decisions around net politics on the German and European level. The image I want to start this talk with is the image of Wernher von Braun. He built rockets, we all know that, and he built the rockets and the Nazis used the rockets, and Wernher von Braun didn't feel really responsible for that because he said that's not his department. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they came down? And that's a state of mind I don't really like because it leads to false decision, it leads to dual-use technology which is used for the bad, and we all know that technology itself, it's not good or bad, or it isn't even neutral because it depends on what decisions you make on how to use it, and that's valid for rockets and that's valid for software too. The problem with that is that we all live in kind of a happy bubble. I'm not a developer, I just studied computer science and worked at some development project during my studies, and now I'm working on some open source projects, but that's kind of a hobby for me, so you all might have a lot more experience. But the thing I really observed is that people often don't think about what they are doing. The moment where I was kind of politicized was when I was working at a research lab in Japan, and I was doing some machine learning software and camera recognition software, and it was already fascinating and it was intellectually challenging, and I really liked to work there. And then I was thinking about what do they use it for, what I'm doing, and then it came out that they wanted to use it for behavior detection at railway stations, to see if the person who's hanging around is somehow behaving suspiciously or he's somehow doing something bad, and then you get a green marker if the person is behaving like you want it, and gets a red marker if the person isn't behaving like expected, and someone should look after that. And I found that's a bit awkward. Actually, I don't really want to work on such a thing because it can be used for profiling people or for discriminating people or for just telling people they don't fit into the pattern of a working society or what you expect them to be. That's the moment where I started thinking about that I have to look into more than just programming or the code, but I have to look into the political responsibilities and the political backgrounds. That's also the moment where I decided to get active, and I got active in some activist circles, and then after that got to netpolitik.org. And actually I had another job as a programmer, but I kind of gave up this job. I will explain later why. Today I want to talk just about privacy because if I wanted to talk about all net politic topics that are broken, it would be a talk with no end, and I don't want to talk so much because I want to have a discussion with you. And to tell what is broken with privacy, I just want to give a few examples what has been going wrong in the last years. And I don't want to just paint a catastrophe picture, but I want to also then give some hints on what we could do as users, what we could do as developers and as humans to solve some of those problems. Some hint we can get if we look how bad the situation is, if we look at the common vulnerabilities and exploits that you might know is a system where you can register vulnerabilities you discovered and categorize them, and we see at this graphic the number of vulnerabilities discovered in a year just is growing. But I also have to say that isn't an absolute statistic because there are some side effects for sure. Like, it's also good if more vulnerabilities are discovered, because like if more are discovered, more can be closed, and that we don't discover them doesn't mean that they are not there. And also, like, bigger, widely used software is like audited more often, and so we find more bugs and more vulnerabilities in this code than in some smaller projects. So nobody hinders you to like report a bug you found in some student's program to them, but in the end it wouldn't have such a big effect. And I want to give some examples, and one example is that often people don't really care about security, so they have really weak security practices. We had last year, or this year, I'm not sure, we had the case of NQ Vault. I don't know if you know this program. It pretended to encrypt like data on your device, like on your smartphone or something else, but it came out that it didn't really do it. Like it encrypted the first 265 bytes, and then everything was in clear text, and even those first bytes of a message or of a data container were just like encrypted with an XOR and like really not secure. And then we have some cases where, like, you maybe remember this TV Monde hack we had, where some attackers like attacked this TV network, and then there was this image in the news shows that like where you saw the password hanging in the bags. That's like just like bad OPSEC, and that's also a case where much goes wrong. And then of course, like we all might know this SSL TLS disaster we had the last year. So we had it starting with the go to fail like in the beginning of 2014, and then we had like the freak attack, and we had Poodle, and we had Heartbleed. So like all this basics of security on the internet, of encrypted communication, on end-to-end encryption for your internet connections was kind of really shattered, and we didn't know what to do. And on the one hand, there were the problems which were caused by just bugs, so errors programmers made, like in go to fail or in the Heartbleed case. And on the other side, we had some bad organizational structures, because Poodle and the freak attack could only be done when like the server accepted weak versions of SSL or TLS, which shouldn't be supported anymore. In most cases, just of compatibility issues. And there's another threat. So we don't have the threats which are kind of homemade. There are threats we really can't grasp, or we really don't know how big they are. It's like intelligence agencies, law enforcement, politics in general want to have our data. So they do it in different ways. Like the most obvious way that they implant backdoors into software, but they don't only implant backdoors into software, they even implant backdoors into standards. And that's the case where we are kind of helpless, because we are not the people making standards. Like I think most of you are not the people making standards. And the processes are kind of intransparent for us. And so if something is an industry standard, we can't do anything about it. And we had this case that the NSA paid RSA to have this weak random number generator in a crypto library as a default, and then it was already standardized in 2004, and at that point of time people thought like something is wrong with that standard, something we don't trust at all, but nobody changed anything. And then 2014 it just came out that it had been compromised by the NSA, and so the random number generator wasn't really random. And 10 years, really nothing could be done, and like we assume the NSA could like exploit this vulnerability they themselves implanted into the standard without anyone caring at all. Another thing on an organizational level was the Gemalto SIM card hack, where the NSA and GCHQ were stealing keys from SIM cards from the manufacturers of the SIM cards, or at least from Gemalto, which is like the biggest manufacturer, one of the biggest. And then they could compromise like the connection encryption between the cell phone and the antenna, which made like rendered the encryption useless on the phone network. And they could even incorporate like SIM cards, so they could basically forge them and incorporate another identity to compromise people. Another thread is more lying in the open. It's like what politicians demand us to do. And in the last month, we had like a really disturbing evolution of people saying, we need your keys, we need the keys to fight terrorists, we need the keys to fight crime, and we all want that you drop your encryption keys at some governmental level or at your telecommunications providers so we can access it if you're doing something wrong. That whole process started with Barack Obama and David Cameron. So they said, yeah, we need to have the keys to find the terrorists. And then like our German Minister of the Interior just joined that voice and said, yeah, we need to have it. And then some guy of the NSA said, yeah, but maybe we can distribute the keys to the telcos and to the politics and to the law enforcement agencies. So only if they work together, then you can really decrypt the messages of a person. But actually, at least for the case in Germany, where I'm coming from, it was like 10 or like 15 years ago, the politics said, they made a resolution and they said, we don't want to give people the keys to someone else, so they have really the control over their keys, because otherwise encryption is useless. So it can't be that someone else holds the keys and is responsible for that, because that's not encryption and that's not secure and confidential communications. So the question is, what can we do about it? Like, we have this whole mess of problems. Some problems are like human-made, some problems are like too big for us to influence them, but anyways, there are ways around it, or ways to like at least go into the right direction to solve those problems. Because not only the laws force us to do things, but also like the code says what is done. So if there is a law and you just like follow the law blindly in implementing like data retention into your systems, then of course data retention will be there, but systems can be designed in a way that it's not so easy to collect like the personal data of all the people in such a convenient way for the government and in such a convenient way for criminals also, because we have to keep in mind that if such a lot of personal data is in the hands of the government or in the hands of some law enforcement agencies, it will be like really a single point of attack. And we recognize very often that the systems of our government agencies are not really secure. We had this hack of the German parliament. We published today at netzpolitik.org like an investigative report of a person who got access to the computers of parliamentarians and could really analyze what was going on, because like our federal agency for information security doesn't give any information. So they left the parliamentarians in the dark what was happening and how they could work. And so we had a lot of rumors going on from like the summer break of the parliament has to be before, because they have to exchange all the hardware and you can't work anymore, and we can't stop that data is flowing into the wrong hands, and they didn't know where the attackers come from, and then there were wild speculations. But if you imagine that for like the whole bunch of communication data for all the citizens in a country, then you say like, okay, that's not what we want. We don't want the computers of the parliamentarians compromised, but we also don't want like centralized databases with our own data compromised. And we can be quite sure that this will happen if data is at a central single point of failure. Another thing is that we have to work on our own OPSEC and best practices, because we know, even if we know about like how a password should look like, that a password shouldn't be trivial, it's far too often the case that nobody really cares about it. So we know it, but we do otherwise, and that's a problem. And the problem is that not only we do it sometimes, but like the normal average user will do it in a pretty bad way, and the normal average user can be educated. So it's also in our responsibility to design systems so they kind of force the user or give the user advice how to use them securely and how to make them privacy friendly or to configure them privacy friendly. So it's not only giving restrictions on passwords and saying you need to have at least 8 characters and numbers and alphanumerical and whatever, but it's also to design like the flow of a program so that the user can really understand what is going on, what are the privacy settings, and what is collected about her or him. And that's like a really simple step, which is often not done, like especially if you look into like open source software. We still have the debate on PGP that GNU-PG nobody of the normal users will use because it's too difficult. That's a problem because often we don't understand why it's so difficult because we somehow learn to deal with the systems and we need to get in contact to the normal user to really find out what they need to make aware decisions. Another thing is that we far too often rely on legacy software and that we far too often don't keep our systems up to date. Like that doesn't only apply to systems in general, not only to Windows XP, but it also applies to libraries. So far too often backups are not made, far too often we don't update libraries, and far too often like programs are just like in the wild and nobody cares about them anymore. So that's also a problem someone could solve and someone should solve, like to feel responsible to really care about what is going on, which vulnerabilities do we have, and then not to support like older versions of SSL, for example, because it's known to be easily to like compromise the communication then. The other thing I really got mad at sometimes is a culture of bug reporting. When I was like working on some software project, it was in most cases the case that if you were responsible for a bug, it was kind of like a shaming situation, or you couldn't feel like good if you had to tell people you did a lot of shit and like those shit had really big influences onto the code you wrote. And we need to come away from this, because if there is such a culture or such like an atmosphere of really the shaming of the people who did the bugs, then nobody will report them and nobody will speak openly about it. And we know that we all make bugs. And so this should be kind of normal. So we need a change of the attitude here. And like, for example, this year on the Chaos Communication Camp, we will also do a special track for, we call it Failosophy, like the culture of failing, to create an awareness that we all fail and that we have to find some ways to deal with it, which are not just ignoring it or being ashamed of it. Connected to this is also like the culture of auditing, because we know software engineering practices how to audit code properly, but there are like some obstacles we encounter many, many times. So often, like, to audit code is a thing you do when you have time. That's like, at least my experience when I was working on projects, which hopefully isn't the case everywhere, but I just like saw enough examples of people not auditing code or just like having some bug testing with like this Steve Irwin method, like just pointing a stick on it and like seeing if something comes out and otherwise just assuming everything's right. And another big problem is that often like code is not readable and people don't follow best practices to make code readable. Like people implement implicit side effects because it's kind of elegant, and people like prefer like the performance over the readability, which is kind of understandable. But if we go to security sensitive software, this is, in my opinion, not the way it should go, because otherwise we will implement loopholes, or we will implement like parts of software where nobody else can understand, and that's not what people should do when it comes to cryptography or something else. And connected to the readability of the code is that we have like a strong need for free software and open software, because it's a necessary condition to find bugs and backdoors. Because if we have a closed system, for sure we can't find them. We can just like find them if we investigate it, but we can't find them in looking at the code. But all this doesn't help if like security software, even if it's open source and free, isn't audited. So we discover vulnerabilities in PGP, Tor, and OTR all the time. And those pieces of software have a large community, at least, where people can look into. But if you look at the fail in OpenSSL, where there are just like 2 main developers and one guy who made this mistake, so you can easily understand that it wasn't even like realistic that someone could find this piece of code by just looking into it if you have 2 people and like thousands of lines of code. So there is also like a responsibility for auditing if you just use the software. So we see a change in the attitude there, that sometimes bigger companies who can afford their own auditing teams for foreign open source software feel responsible for contributing to the security of this software, but it's not widespread enough. So we also demand, like, at least in Germany, that the government cares about it. So the government cares about supporting security technologies they rely on, like PGP and other stuff. So there is far more awareness needed to really have a good auditing and to really have auditing that's supported and not just like a side effect which you can do if you can afford it in the end of a project. And all this topic brings us to the question of trust, because when can we trust that a software is somehow secure, or at least we can say we did everything for the software or for the security to be secure? And for sure, it comes to open source again, but it isn't possible all the time, because often the systems underneath the software layers are closed and we can't look into them. We have black boxes which are created, for example, by Microsoft when they implement their trusted computing technology, and we can't really do anything about it, and we are just like relying on them to do nothing right. And we saw a lot of times in the last year that they don't manage to do it right all the way, and we don't have alternatives. So it's not the problem that they make mistakes or they have those big patch failures when nothing is booting anymore and they have to withdraw patches and give out new patches, and it's kind of really chaotic situation and nobody knows what's going on with them. But the problem is that we don't have alternatives. So we have a lock-in system, and with the trusted platform module, like in the version 2, we even have a more locked-in system, because you can't switch off this security platforms for your computers or smartphones or anything anymore. So even if I boot a Linux, they are dependent on Microsoft, so they assign their bootloader so it can boot. And that's a situation we don't want to have, because then there is again a single source of failure we all are depending on, even if we do good software or even if we use alternative systems. And it comes to the control question, because like if we have a system, or if we own a system, or if we own a device, we want to have the control over the device, because otherwise it's inherent that security can't be guaranteed and security can't be enforced if we have no influence in what is going on. Another thing that could help us to make more secure systems is for sure cryptography. And the good thing about cryptography is that the mathematics behind the cryptography are working. So we don't have like rocket science systems, and most of the cryptographic methods are there since like 20 or 30 years, even before they were implemented. And they are kind of, like most of them are kind of provable. But we have to care that we really use those systems, and we use those systems with strong parameters, because nothing like is helping if we choose like weak key length, or if we choose like weak algorithms, or if we choose like versions of algorithms which are known to be vulnerable for something. But like in the end, we have really to enforce to deploy strong cryptography. And we have to care about like data minimization. That's a point where I think it is often neglected, because if you collect a lot of data, you can do a lot of fun stuff with it. So nobody would say that's not true. So the more data you have, the more you can derive, the more stuff you can do, the more comfort for the user or you can generate by just like recommending him what he should do next. And maybe that's not what we want to do, because like maybe we don't want to collect all the data, maybe we want to erase the data if it's not needed anymore, but far too often this is neglected entirely. But there are enough privacy-enhancing techniques out there, and we know them. That's also a point in like my own history where I got really upset, because like I mentioned the job I had before, and it was that I was working in smart grid security and privacy, and I was like implementing a technical guideline from the German government. It was quite new and it wasn't ready, so I made some remarks, and then like the answer I got like is, yeah, sure, you're right, there is something wrong with there, but in the end we don't want to have so much privacy because we couldn't use the data for anything commercial anymore. And that was a point where I quitted that job, because like, why do you do this? Like, why do you pretend to have like privacy preserving systems or privacy enhancing techniques when you in the end don't enforce them and get back to the point where you just want to like sell the data or use the data for marketing purposes, even in such a sensitive area like the electricity in your own home? So to conclude this, we know that open source and encryption can change the game because they can make us somehow independent from what's going on in the closed source commercial world. And at the moment, in my opinion, those are the only ones we can use to defend somehow against this big apparatus of state surveillance, this big apparatus of commercial surveillance. Because we know that even the NSA has problems to tackle some of those security programs. We know that they have struggled very much to de-anonymize Tor users if they keep the best practices. We know that it's a problem to get PGP keys. We just got like this light eater attack where PGP keys were read from hardware, like where you could do nothing against it because it was like a compromised BIOS. But in the end, that's the only thing that can help and like help us to create some better world where things are not so bad. And what we should also care about is that if people start to really focus on open source and secure software, it can be a market advantage in the end. That's like what people need to hear, because like up until now, like to implement privacy preserving techniques into software is mostly overhead if you don't do like explicit privacy software, and so it's like a cost factor which is just like valuable if you are like the target of some attack and if there is something happening. Otherwise, if you don't deploy any security and nothing happens, it will save you money, and that is not the case we want it to be, because we want it to be like a market advantage if you have privacy preserving software and if you have software that respects the privacy of the user. And we can see that it's somehow working, not for everyone yet, but it's somehow working because like Google in the last year decided to rank like websites with an HTTPS connection higher in their search results. And we can discuss about if that's good or bad and if that's neutral or not, but it's a sign that somehow minds are changing and somehow the development is going into a direction where really users demand privacy and companies help to enforce this. And then there's like an important question we have to ask ourselves, like if everything that's technically possible should really be done, like if all the data we could collect should really be collected. Like we see this, we have this data retention discussion now in Germany, and there are easy ways around it. There is like mailing services which don't collect your personal data, so they can't give it out to law enforcement agencies. So if the state asks for who is behind this IP address or behind this email address, they just won't find out because the providers themselves don't have the data. And so it's more complicated for them because all the paying process to make it anonymous is kind of like complicated, but they say we don't want to have that data because like we have the responsibility for the data if it's on our servers, and we have to decide what we want to do and if we want to give it to the state or not. So just by thinking about what you can avoid or what is like the advantage for you not to have the data or not to process the data in a way that we are profiling a person is really a big help. And then there's another thing which is like, we shouldn't obey everything what we should work on. Like often people get to work on a topic which is kind of sensitive, like camera surveillance and like other things. And at the moment we recognize that we can't we don't want to feel responsible for what we are doing. We shouldn't do it anymore. That's what I was really shocked by when I was working in Japan, because nobody was asking themselves, is it okay what we are doing? Is it what implications does it have? What implications does it have for society? And in the end, it's just my day job. And that's an attitude I've heard many, many times from my study colleagues also. So I said I want to earn money and I want to have a day job, and then I go home and I don't care about it. But that's not the way it can be, because otherwise we can't we have to take the responsibility for what we are doing, and we have to think about it. And if something happens we can't feel responsible for anymore, we should report it to someone for sure. We should report it first to the ones we are working for, to tell them that we are not going with them at that point. But if they don't react, we should report it to someone else. We have a lot of debates about responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities, but also on organizational failures, and we still don't have really good rules or good laws to protect the people who report those vulnerabilities or those organizational deficits, and they still have to be afraid to be put in jail or to pay high fines if they tell the world about problems in their companies. And also we should look at all those NDAs where we have people forced not to talk about what they are doing, and we have to think about if that's really the right approach, because we have to give people the possibility to talk about what they are doing if they have the feeling they are doing something wrong. Then the basic message I want to send is that we all should be political, because what we are doing is political, even if we don't see it in the first place. Everything in this life is political, and so we should take the responsibility for what we are doing. And that's what I wanted to say. Yep, so you might ask questions. Yep.
So probably for me, one of the biggest privacy, it's not sort of problems, is Gmail. I've got a Gmail account, and if you can search it, then you know all the words in it. But you need to know all the words in it to be able to spam filter it and things. Got any good solutions for me? I don't have any good solutions for myself. So
but why do you use Gmail if you have a problem with that? Just don't use it.
I have a problem with bad email clients as well.
Okay, I don't have problems with bad emails, and I'm not using Gmail, but I have I'm kind of torn in between, because Google is doing a lot of good things about privacy. So they develop a lot of software, they develop a lot of techniques, and they really test a lot of things. They have this Google Zero team, which is looking into software, auditing it, searching for vulnerabilities. They are doing all this great stuff, and where people really can benefit from, and then they are collecting a lot of data. So I'm kind of torn, because I think Google is not bad like most people say, in this privacy or community or those activist community, but I think they are doing something bad. They say they won't be evil, but they have too much data not to be evil. So they can be made evil, and if someone gets access to this data, and if they have so much data, someone will be interested in the data. So that's a problem. And I think if you say you have a problem with bad emailers, then people should support better emailers, because that's we have to build we have to decentralize infrastructures. So all the time, if we have a centralized infrastructure, it's vulnerable and it gets too big for us to really grasp what's going on. And there we should go into a more decentralized way of solving problems, or a more decentralized way of providing technologies, in my opinion. Yep.
How do you see the role of people like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange raising awareness
Actually, I didn't mention the name of Edward Snowden quite, yeah. I didn't want to mention it because I have some kind of problem with that. I said like people should kind of blow the whistle if something is wrong is going on. That's the point. Like Edward Snowden did this, Julian Assange did publish a lot of documents, but in this whole debate around this Edward Snowden thing, it's just really personalized. So we all the time look at Edward Snowden, we all the time see that face in The Guardian, and we all the time have this one person, but the thing we neglect when we are doing this is that there are a lot of other people around who should do the same. So they say like, he's a hero, like he is the one who brought us like all this knowledge about the NSA and about the surveillance machine, but that's not enough. Like we can't say no, he did this, he will be the hero of the century, and other people can lay back and do as they did. So we have all to be like those small Edward Snowdens and see what we can disclose and what we should disclose, what's going wrong. So I think they play a really important role, and I think you can discuss if what Julian Assange did was right or wrong, or if it's like the best way to do it like he did. But it's important, maybe it's important to have role models. I'm not a fan of role models, but yeah, for me they are like a bit of pop stars, but we shouldn't be intimidated by that, not to do the same.
Today business, I would say like Google or Facebook or big company, the really huge company, actually survive on the fact that they detain data of users, and they how to give us service for free because they have data. How do you see this, and what do you think should be the model instead?
The first point is to see or to create the awareness that they don't give us these services for free, that we pay for these services with our data. That's like a state of mind many people are in. Like that's a part of the problem, because like people say, why should I use another service where I have to pay for, while I can use this free service? And this notion of free service has to go away, because we are paying with our data. We are just making that they can earn shitloads of money with it. And we have some small alternative email provider in Germany, which is called Posteo. And they have the model that they are really, really privacy preserving. You don't have to give them anything. You can even pay them anonymously with some transaction numbers. And they say, yeah, we want you to choose what you pay us. We want to have like €1 per month, like at the minimum. And they got quite popular since all this NSA disclosures and all those security fuck-ups. So it can be that people shift their behavior, and I really recognize that a lot of people, I'm writing emails to like just abandon their Gmail addresses. That's like really a development I have detected, which might not be the average thing because I'm corresponding with a lot of journalists and other people, but even if I look into my email inbox and I count like the encrypted emails I got like 2 years ago and the amount of encrypted emails I get now, like nowadays, like I think 60 to 70% of the emails I get are encrypted, and like 2 years ago it was like once a day maybe I got an email. So there is a shift of behavior, but it takes time. So if no one has questions, yeah.
You were praising Google more or less about the attempts of showing the world they were working towards security and things like that. But again, because of the NSA disclosures and the documents that came out, we know that Google is one of the main companies these days that have the biggest backdoors in their systems to US government and things like that. So don't you think that those attempts are things that Google is doing just to show off a little bit, but behind the scenes, that's not actually what you mean?
I think we can't answer this question, because I just can answer this question on a personal level. I know people working there, and I know people working there security and privacy, and I know those people are really honest about it. I know those people want to work it, and Google is a place where you can influence a lot of things because they are big. So if you manage to implement some like privacy preserving stuff into Google, many people will be affected and it will have an effect. But on the other side, there is this big company, and there I don't know nothing about it. So there I'm really skeptical, because the company is complying to all those court orders, not the people working on security there. And there I think we have to distinguish between those two worlds between the single people in the company who want maybe to do something good or bring like security forward, and like the company as the company itself, which is complying with law enforcement orders and warrants of governments, like be it like the US or Great Britain or whatever. Okay, if there are no more questions, then thank you again. And if you want to reach me somehow, you can do it there.